Locke and Religious Toleration, Lecture 4. So now we've covered most of the main principles of the letter concerning toleration. That since coercion cannot save, and since religious beliefs and practices do no harm to others, the government has no grounds to suppress any particular form of religious belief or worship or force people to believe or worship in any particular way. In the same way, religious authorities do not have the right to use coercion in the name of salvation, nor do private citizens have the right to use force or coercion in the name of religion. So there's a general duty to tolerate people in their professing and worshiping in accordance with what they believe to be the truth. Now we get to some specific aspects of toleration, and this begins on page 105. And here, what he does in the rest of the letter is he kind of subdivides, you might say, religion into a few different aspects. So on the one hand, there's religious worship. So these are religious ceremonies and prayers and things like that. So in the Catholic Church, Mass and the sacraments and things like that. So there are the things that you believe God has ordered you to do to specifically render honor and glory and worship to Him. So there's religious worship. But then alongside worship, there are also religious beliefs. And he subdivides those beliefs. This has to do with things like faith, just what you believe to be the truth about God, and that's what he calls speculative religious opinions, or just articles of faith. But then there are also religious opinions regarding how people ought to act. And here you're not talking about specific forms of worship, you're talking about things like the Ten Commandments, the kind of the moral teaching of a church. And that's what he calls practical religious opinions. So a religion entails kind of three aspects. The forms of worship, articles of faith, and moral commandments or moral teachings. And Locke says, that the specific rules regarding what should and should not be tolerated depends upon which aspect of religion you're talking about. And so he goes through them, beginning with worship. And on page 105 and in 106, he lays out kind of the basic principle that, if the government were to command people to worship in a certain way, obviously it would be in the name of, we're commanding people to worship this way because that's the way that they will save their souls. And if the government were to forbid particular forms of worship, it would be on the grounds, you're not going to allow people to worship that way because if they worship that way, they'll go to hell. They'll lose salvation. So the motivation for specifically regulating religious worship would be to promote salvation or to prevent damnation. And Locke has already said that coercion can't do that. It doesn't work. It's not just that you shouldn't use coercion to try to save people or prevent their damnation. It's that the use of coercion is ineffective in saving them or preventing them from going to hell. So clearly that applies specifically to worship. So, so what that means is, on the one hand, no form of worship should be compulsory. The government does not have the right to compel people to worship, because obviously that's not going to be effective. As he says near the top of page 105, concerning outward worship, I say in the first place that the magistrate has no power to enforce by law, either in his own church or much less in another, the use of any rites or ceremonies whatsoever in the worship of God. And this not only because these churches are free societies, but because whatsoever is practiced in the worship of God is only so far justifiable as it is believed by those that practice it to be acceptable unto him. Whatsoever is not done with that assurance of faith is neither well in itself, nor can it be acceptable to God. To impose such things, therefore, upon any people contrary to their own judgment is, in effect, to command them to offend God, which, considering that the end of all religion is to please him, and that liberty is essentially necessary to that end, appears to be absurd beyond expression. So, for example, forcing people to convert and worship a certain way. Locke would say that's not only ineffective, it's offensive to God. You are being a hypocrite. But in the same way that no form of worship is to be compelled, he also argues that no form of worship is to be forbidden, specifically forbidden. And that's on page 106. Or at the top of page 106, where he says, in the next place, as the magistrate has no power to impose by his laws the use of any rites and ceremonies in any church, so neither has he any power to forbid the use of such rites and ceremonies as are already received, approved, and practiced by any church, because if he did so, he would destroy the church itself, the end of whose institution is only to worship God with freedom after its own manner. Right, so no worship is to be compelled, no worship is to be forbidden. Now, he addresses on page 105, I believe it is, and 105 and thereafter, this question of, well, now, wait a second. If we're not allowed to forbid any particular religious practices, does that mean that people are allowed to do anything they want as long as they do it in the name of religion? Like, does that mean that you're allowed, to engage in human sacrifice in the name of religion? Because obviously you say, why? If I believe that God wants me to worship him by sacrificing infants, if that's my sincere religious belief, does that mean that since it's my sincere religious belief, that therefore the government has no right to prevent me from doing it? Right? Or in general, do I have a right to do anything I want, provided I believe it's a legitimate form of worship? And Locke's answer is no. No, not at all. That's not what I am saying. Nothing that is illegal or unlawful in the ordinary course of life can be done in the name of religion. Right? So if you're not allowed to murder people, if private citizens are not allowed to take one another's lives, except in self-defense, if you're not allowed to murder people, you're not allowed to sacrifice them either. Right? So this is one of those things where this, in some ways, you can see how here there's the beginning of a difference between how Locke understands toleration and the American understanding of religious liberty. Because basically what Locke is saying here is nobody has the right to be exempt from the law. If something is against the law, then the government can punish you for doing it. And even if you call it a form of worship. So you think about, there are some Native American religions that involve ingesting peyote, which is a hallucinogenic plant, and is regulated by a federal drug law. And so from Locke's perspective, somebody might say, well, I'm not using this as a recreational drug. I'm using peyote as part of a religious ceremony, and therefore I have a right to use it as a legitimate form of worship. Locke would say, nope. If there's a law against it, if the magistrate has determined that the use of hallucinogenic drugs should be illegal, then even if you want to do it as a form of worship, you're still not allowed to do it because it's against the law. The law is the law. And nobody has the right to do illegal things. That's Locke's teaching. So it's not the case that everything has to be tolerated in the name of worship. Nothing that is you could think of it this way, anything that's illegal outside of the church is also illegal inside the church. But then the flip side to this is that anything that is lawful or legal to do in the ordinary course of life must also be permitted as a form of worship. And here he gives the example, somebody might want to say, oh, well, pagan religions that involve animal sacrifice, those are abominations. They should be suppressed. And Locke says, well, no. I mean, if you have the right to slaughter a cow, which we do all the time when we eat beef and make leather, if citizens in the ordinary course of life have the right to slaughter a cow, then they also have a right as a religious society to sacrifice a cow. Right? Because in the eyes of the state, it's the same thing. The state cannot get in and judge, well, that's a false form of worship, so you're not allowed to do it. The state can't get involved in making those kinds of judgments. So in the eyes of the state, killing a cow is killing a cow. And if you're allowed to kill a cow that you own, then it doesn't matter whether you're killing it for food or you're killing it as a religious sacrifice. In the eyes of the state, that's legal. You can do it. So this is why, the way he puts it on page 106 in the last paragraph, he says, This paragraph begins, "By this we see what difference there is between the church and the commonwealth. Whatsoever is lawful in the commonwealth cannot be prohibited by the magistrate in the church." So if you can do it in the ordinary course of life, you can do it as a form of worship. "Whatsoever is permitted unto any of his subjects for their ordinary use, neither can nor ought to be forbidden by him to any sect of people for their religious uses." And here he gives a few examples. We can tell he's addressing a Protestant audience, but it's interesting how he expands things. So I want to read what he says next. It says, "If any man may lawfully take bread or wine, either sitting or kneeling, in his own house, the law ought not to abridge him of the same liberty in his religious worship, though in the church the use of bread and wine be very different, and be there applied to the mysteries of faith and rites of divine worship." Right? So, in other words, if you can sit and eat bread and drink wine in your home, then you must be permitted to kneel and receive communion in a church, because in the eyes of the state, it's the same thing. The only grounds for making a distinction between those two acts is if you are specifically targeting communion as a false religious practice, and we know that the government has no competence to legislate in that area. As he says, but those things that are prejudicial to the commonwealth of a people in their ordinary use and are therefore forbidden by laws, those things ought not to be permitted to churches in their sacred rites. So in other words, but if something's illegal, it's illegal in church too. And that's the basic rule for, so when you're specifically talking about what is the rule concerning toleration with religious worship as opposed to belief, when it comes to religious worship, the rule is if it's generally legal, it is also legal as a form of worship. If it is generally illegal, then it is illegal as a form of worship. So notice that Locke's saying that nobody's entitled to religious exemptions. He even notes on page 106 that he says, let's say there's been a pestilence and it has wiped out most of the cattle in a country. And so the magistrate decides we are going to temporarily ban the slaughter of all cattle so that the herds can repopulate themselves. So no one's allowed to kill a cow. Now that law clearly has a secular purpose, right? The purpose has to do with maintaining, the food and leather supply. And so you're saying because the herds have been so diminished, we are going to prohibit the slaughter of cattle for, let's say, 1 year so that the herds can repopulate themselves. Now, what happens if you belong to a religion that believes that you must regularly sacrifice cattle to appease or to please your God? In the United States, I think a lot of people might instinctively say, well, those people should have a right to an exemption, right? In the same way that like Quakers don't have to bear arms in the military, the Amish don't have to send their children to high school. We might say that, if you belong to a religion that sincerely believes that the sacrifice of cattle is a part of regular worship that you must engage in, say, well, they should be exempt from that law. They should be allowed to continue to slaughter cows. And Locke says, no. The law says you don't do it. Nobody has a right to be exempt from the law because this law has a legitimate purpose. And so it's too bad, but what Locke would say is this is not an example of religious persecution. This sect is not being targeted and specifically prohibited from sacrificing cows to their god. It's just that this church is made up of citizens who live under a law which says that citizens are not allowed to slaughter cattle for a certain period of time. So no exemption. And this, again, as I said, it's summarized on page 106. The discussion of the cow is in the big paragraph in the middle of page 106. And if there were more time, I would read through more of that, but there's really not a need to go into any more detail about that. So when it comes to the toleration of worship, if it's lawful in society, it's lawful as worship. If it's unlawful in society, it's unlawful as worship. But then we move on to the question of religious belief. And this discussion really starts on page, there's some stuff I'm skipping over, but so it's on page 108 and thereabout. So when it comes to religious belief, remember there are two aspects to it. On the one hand, there are articles of faith. And this is what he calls speculative opinions. So these are merely the opinions you have regarding the divine. Like, do you believe in one God? Do you believe in a Trinitarian God? Do you believe in the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity? Do you believe that there is one God and Allah is Muhammad is his prophet? So these are just beliefs, just the things you hold to be true. And Locke argues that when it comes to speculative opinions, that really there should be total toleration. And the reason why is because, and this is on page 107, is because it is impossible through coercion to alter people's opinions in these areas in any way. As he says, the articles of religion, this is the second to last paragraph on page 107. The articles of religion are some of them practical and some speculative. Now, though both sorts consist in the knowledge of the truth, yet these, which is to say, speculative opinions, terminate simply in the understanding. Right? So in other words, it's just, I believe this to be true, that to be true. Whereas practical opinions, those influence the will and manners. So notice your practical opinions, your moral opinions, do not simply affect what you believe, they also affect how you act. But for example, just believing that there's one God does not have any immediate practical result. It doesn't immediately lead to any kind of decision about how you should act. And as he says, speculative opinions, so what I would call articles of faith, like what you find in the Apostles' Creed. Speculative opinions, therefore, and articles of faith, as they are called, which are required only to be believed, cannot be imposed on any church by the law of the land. For it is absurd that things should be enjoined by laws which are not in men's power to perform. Right? So in other words, it is absurd to make laws commanding people to do things that they cannot do, or forbidding them from doing things that they must do. Right? The ought implies can, and so laws should regulate behavior that's actually possible. It says, but to believe this or that to be true does not depend upon our will. And that goes back to his earlier argument that coercion cannot affect what you believe to be true, because you can't control what you believe to be true. You can't will yourself to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. So in the same way, you can't will yourself to believe in a religious faith that you disagree with. So since coercion cannot produce faith, there should be no direct regulation of mere articles of faith. The more difficult area is when you get to what he calls practical opinions. So basically moral commandments, because this is the real area where you can have conflict between religious authorities and the state, because obviously the state issues commands and prohibitions in the form of laws. But when it comes to moral teaching, religious authorities issue commands. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. So insofar as both your religion and your government issues rules for how you should act, there is the potential for those rules to conflict, where the state might command you to do something that your religion forbids. Your religion might command you to do something that the state forbids. Right? Your religion might command you or might forbid you from doing something the state commands you to do, and you see how this works. So what do we do then? What are the rules regarding toleration where the practical opinions or the moral teachings of the church conflict with the law? And Locke starts, he says on page 108, he says, look, obedience to God is the greatest priority. Right? So you should always, your primary concern is with obedience to God, not obedience to the state. And that's why he says in the middle of page 108, every man has an immortal soul, capable of eternal happiness or misery, whose happiness, depending upon his believing and doing those things in this life which are necessary to the obtaining of God's favor and are prescribed by God to that end. It follows from thence, first, that the observance of these things is the highest obligation that lies upon mankind, and that our utmost care, application, and diligence ought to be exercised in the search and performance of them, because there is nothing in this world that is of any consideration in comparison with eternity. Right? So salvation of your soul should be your utmost priority. But then he adds a second thing. He says, secondly, that seeing one man does not violate the right of another by his erroneous opinions, an undue manner of worship, nor is his perdition of any prejudice to another man's affairs. Therefore, the care of each man's salvation belongs only to himself. And then I put in parentheses, but he goes on to say, of course, that we're allowed to offer charitable advice and admonition. We can try to persuade people to otherwise. But generally speaking, since false religious beliefs and false worship and even going to hell does not inflict harm on other people, then it's on you. You are responsible for the care of your soul. I'm responsible for the care of my soul, and nobody should be compelling anybody else. But then this raises a question, which he gets to on page 109. That's all well and good, but what if the government orders me to do something that is contrary to my religion? Right? What should I do? And Locke's argument is, first of all, under any form of good government, that's not likely to happen. Right? A government that knows that its primary purpose is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens is rarely going to be passing laws that run athwart of religious moral teachings. But nonetheless, it's possible, and when it happens, Locke basically says, disobey. Right? Obedience to God comes first. So if the state commands you to do something that is contrary to your religion, then refuse to do it. But recognize that the government has the right to punish you. The government has the right to enforce laws. And so if because of your religious conscience you cannot comply with the law, that's fine. Don't do it. But the government has the right to punish you. Right? This begins at the bottom of page 109. Right, and this is the way he puts it. Some may ask, what if the magistrate should enjoin anything by his authority that appears unlawful to the conscience of a private person? I answer that if government be faithfully administered and the counsels of the magistrate be indeed directed to the public good, this will seldom happen. But if perhaps it do so fall out, I say that such a private person is to abstain from the actions he judges unlawful, and he is to undergo the punishment which is not unlawful for him to bear. For the private judgment of any person concerning a law enacted in political matters for the public good does not take away the obligation of that law, nor deserve a dispensation. So in other words, no religious exemptions are required. So you've got to undergo the lawful punishment. But then, and there's an important ground there, because he says, otherwise you find yourself in a situation where you are putting your own judgment above the law, and that's not going to work. For civil society to hold together, people must be subject to the law. They can't get to pick and choose which laws they obey and which laws they don't. So the government has the right to enforce the laws. Now he goes on after that and through page 110 to consider the question, well, but what if the government is actually has passed a law that isn't for the public good, that actually goes beyond their power? Say like, what if you have a government that tries to compel you to adopt a particular religion? What about then? And Locke basically says, well, you don't have to obey the law. And in that case, if it's truly an illegitimate law, you would have the right to try to avoid punishment, right? Because technically in that area, the government doesn't have the right to punish you. Now, but as he says, you're probably going to get punished anyways. Usually when private people take on the government, private people lose, right? So look, that's just the way it works. Disobey the law, try to avoid punishment if it's an illegitimate law, but recognize that in the course of human affairs, that's a dangerous path. There's no guarantee you're going to win. This is the way he puts it on page 110: is you have the right to resist in those cases, but you're probably going to lose. and God alone judges. There's a big paragraph in the middle of page 1010, which I don't think I have time um, to read. But at the end of it, he says, "You will say then that the magistrate, being the stronger, will have his will and carry his point." Right? That if I resist the government's probably going to win. And Locke says, without doubt. But the question is not here concerning the doubtfulness of the event, but the rule of right. So, in other words, the question is not what actually happens, but who has the right to do what. And in circumstances where you have a genuinely illegitimate law, especially one that encroaches upon kind of the religious duties of private persons, in a illegal or in a way that's not necessary for the public good, in those circumstances, you have the right to resist, but that doesn't mean your resistance will be successful. Now, this lecture is already 25 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. There's going to be one more lecture on the letter concerning toleration, where I talk briefly about 4 things that Locke believes do not have to be tolerated in the name of religion.